I wanted to focus on what has happened in the United States with the Trump administration. To start, I wanted to just talk about us, because I think we can start to use that word of who we are. And the Trump nightmare really began in 2016. But what were we doing in those years? You may remember that Minor last night said that he met Alex and a kind of quiet guy, that was me, and why did he meet us? Because we had come to Guatemala to recruit him to help us with an international action that we were trying to organize at that time. What was the action? It was a caravan that started in Honduras, went through El Salvador, came here to Guatemala, traveled all the way across Mexico, all the way across the United States to New York City, to the United Nations, where they were having a gathering about the drug war, a special session of the United Nations to talk about the drug war. And we wanted to bring a message from the places most affected by that war. And so Minor and Alex and Marco Castillo, who you're going to be meeting later today, Ernesto Ledesma, Laura Krasovitsky, who's part of the team here, Laura Carlson, all were part of helping to bring that action together. And so the heart of that caravan is here in the room with you. And I just want everyone to know that we didn't start yesterday. While we were organizing that and carrying out that caravan, the Trump storm was on the horizon like a cloud. And a few things happened that year that were startling. There was an election in England called Brexit, where they decided, oh, we're not going to be part of Europe's economy in the same way anymore. It was strange, but it went by. In Colombia, after very difficult peace negotiations, signing the peace, there was a referendum to approve the accord, and shockingly, it was defeated. So we saw some clouds on the horizon, as I'd say. Trump comes to office, and in Colombia, I'm with Alex, we're organizing a caravan locally in Colombia to support the peace process. And on the way down there, Trump, while I'm traveling, Trump is elected. So we were startled, somewhat terrified. Ernesto Ledesma, a couple of months later, came to me with an initiative, another caravan against fear, all across the border between the United States and Mexico. So those are the things we were doing to oppose Trump. And the first Trump administration, which ended almost 5 years ago, was bad. Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, scuttled the Iran nuclear deal, and during the pandemic, he arguably killed a lot of people in the United States with his terrible policies. But it ended, and the institutions in the United States that we've become used to, sometimes fighting against them, but familiar, they were still intact. Even after the right-wing rebellion on January 6th of 2021. So it ended in chaos, and then came the 5 years. I'm going to skip those because not that much happened. A lot of bad things, particularly the war in Gaza, which many of the people in the first panel spoke to eloquently. That's only gotten worse. We'll get back to that. But the reasons that Trump was not able to establish the kind of fascist regime that we are now embarking on in the United States was that there was pushback from his own staff in the White House. There was pushback in the courts against the cronyism and corruption that he was trying to bring. Even the Congress and some Republicans from his own party pushed back. to save Obamacare, for example. There was pushback from people in the government and civil society who saw their role as independent arbiters within the system. People even in organizations that I generally fear and loathe, like the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Pentagon. In all those places, there was opposition to the fascist project. There was pushback in social media, or media organizations like Twitter and Facebook banned Trump from even being able to post on their sites. So all those things happened, and some people breathed a big sigh of relief. They thought, oh, the threat is over. Now, what is the difference? This time, when Trump has taken office, he has put into his staff not people with competence or experience, but people who are absolutely loyal to him. The Congress is completely intimidating. If you were a Republican that had doubts about Trump, you've been eliminated now. You have been purged from the party. So there's no one in the party willing to stand up to Trump and stop him in any meaningful way that we've seen, at least till now. The gatekeepers, the people within the institutions, they've been eliminated. The military, and it's an important factor in the United States, are keeping a very low profile. In the previous administration, some of them spoke out, particularly in the context of the Black Lives Matter protests that followed the murder of George Floyd. Some of the top people in the high military circles pushed back when Trump wanted to use the military to repress those demonstrations. All of those gatekeepers are gone. And so what has that meant? For people in the United States, there's some very serious things going on that are far beyond what a usual change of power implies. Trump is trying to eliminate whole institutions. For example, the Department of Education. He's trying to simply eliminate it. That's crazy. He is attempting to undermine the independence of universities across the country, forcing his agenda to be their agenda. That if they don't carry out his ideas about how to repress pro-Palestinian demonstrations, if he does not carry out their ideas about how to eliminate language from the vocabulary. And just to make that point clear, Trump has put out executive orders, many executive orders, some of the first of which were aimed at words and concepts. He said that you cannot no longer talk about transgender or transgender rights. You cannot talk about equity. You cannot talk about racism. You cannot talk about inclusion. You cannot talk about climate change. If those things are in federal documents, there's whole teams of people being instructed to eliminate those words. This is fascism. This is something tremendously dangerous. In terms of science, he has also done that. He's made climate change a verboten concept, and he's gone after the Environmental Protection Agency, firing without cause many of the best scientists in the Environmental Protection Agency and many other research agencies. It's a disaster what is happening. And that's particularly alarming in terms of health, where he has put in charge of the nation's health a certified anti-vaxxer and loco who happens to be the son of, he's a Kennedy, but he's crazy and he shouldn't be there. Simply that. Trump is using extra constitutional means to carry out these actions. Since he has been elected, and it's only been 3 months, 100 days, he has declared 8 national emergencies I can't even remember, honestly, what these emergencies are supposed to be. One of them is that we're being invaded, the United States, by Venezuela, and therefore we need to put into place a law from the 1700s to send people out of the country. So Trump is using the hate against immigrants to fuel his anti-constitutional intents. We know about the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. This has been a very prominent case. This is a man completely innocent, grabbed out of his home, off the street, and sent to Secot prison in El Salvador. It's a very important case and one that has reached the Supreme Court. Trump has thus far defied the courts on this issue. And this is a dangerous sign that the last line of defense in the United States, the one branch of government that hasn't been completely suborned to Trump, his strategy appears to be just to, if he doesn't get the decision that he wants, he's going to just ignore what the court said. Another mark of real fascist, this is fascism. Foreign policy, I'm not going to go into it deeply. Nancy covered that topic amply this morning, but it's worth saying that Trump promised Arab American people in general, that he was going to find a solution for Gaza. It was bullshit. There was a ceasefire, a momentary ceasefire that made a lot of people relax about the situation, and then the war resumed. Just over this weekend, we've seen a new offensive from Israel that is even more horrifying than the ones we've seen previously. While we're here speaking, people are dying in a genocidal war, and Trump is part and parcel of making that go from bad, terrible, to even worse. So there are so many different areas where Trump is on the attack that we have become confused. And I think it's very important to underline that we have to find a way to push back strategically, because the crisis that is upon us is one that has many different faces. And so we have to learn to recognize which ones of these are the faces that we can deal with and which are the ones that we just have to forget. And this is not easy because it's like a fire hose coming from the Trump administration. Every day they do or say or declare something totally outrageous, whether it's taking over Panama, whether it's invading Canada, taking over Gaza and making it into a seafront, hotel district. Every day they're saying something, and we are exhausted, and the civil society is exhausted, but there's been and has started to be real pushback. There's pushback in the courts. One of the things Trump does, and this connects to what we're going to be talking about later in terms of lawfare, is when there are immigrants that he wants to deport extra-constitutionally, he sends them to the 5th Judicial Circuit. In the United States, there's, I think, 9 or 10 different judicial circuits. He sends them to the 5th Judicial Circuit geographically because that's where the judges who are most conservative and aligned with his practices are based. So he knows he will get the kind of rulings that he's looking for if he can physically send people there. So these are the kinds of things we're facing. The courts, especially the lower courts, are pushing back a lot. One of the things that Trump achieved for himself during his first term was that he put 2 new judges on the Supreme Court, giving the conservatives a 6-3 majority. So now when the Supreme Court is pushing back against Trump, they're doing it with actually a conservative majority on the court. So that has weakened the resistance. In the streets, we've already seen mobilizations that have involved as many as 1 million people at the same time being out in the streets in different parts of the country. This is a hopeful sign. Trump's ratings in the polls have dropped enormously, and I forgot to even mention the whole issue of tariffs, the aranceles. These are extremely important to try to understand, but as Nancy said, Trump is not using the tariffs as an economic tool. He is using them as a political weapon and a way to enrich himself and his cronies, and it's being applied in a way that makes no economic sense, whether you're a Marxist or a capitalist, or it doesn't matter. What he's doing doesn't actually make sense economically, and it's almost certain to bring the United States and probably a lot of other countries into economic recession and very difficult times. So that's kind of where we are, and there's many battles to come. I think how am I doing on time? Simple, okay. Trump, in my opinion, is crashing the US empire. And he's not doing it the way that we would like. We would like to crash the US empire peacefully, slowly, take the air out of the tires, and just be done with it. That's what many of us have been struggling for decades, is to bring an end to that imperial relationship, specifically in our hemisphere, to the United States dominance. Who needs it? We're tired of it. But the way he's implementing this, what he's doing is not bringing down the empire in a way that's healthy or going to help us. So, however, it does open up, I think, real opportunities. Namely, when the empire disappears, it opens up space for other political possibilities. So the things that we've been looking for, another world is possible, the World Social Forum, the ideas that have been floating for many years, they're ideas that we need to grab a hold of and use now. We need to think together. We need to build coalitions. And it's easy to say we need to build coalitions. It's much harder to do it. We need to make friends, or at least establish alliances with people we don't necessarily agree with 100%. We need to make alliances even with people that we don't like all that much. That's what we have to do. Probably for me, that the key example of that, and I refer you to an article of mine that's in the information packet. The key 1 minute. Was that the alliance between the anti-fascist alliance between the powers of England and France and the United States with Russia, Soviet Union, to defeat a yet greater threat. They didn't make friends, but in this moment where we're facing crisis and opportunity, we can't be afraid of coalitions. Coalitions are about picking our political battles. It's about the kind of political maturity that can let us win without abandoning our vision and our ideals. And we've got a lot to talk about, and I thank you all so very much for giving me the time to talk. Bueno,
Pues gracias, Ted. Él nos ofrece algunas claves para entender, digamos, el primer periodo de Trump con este segundo periodo de Trump, algunas claves los mecanismos que han servido para la perpetuidad de la cooptación, pero con otros actores, con algunos ejemplos que nos ponía. Pero me quedo con esto de que este escenario también ofrece la oportunidad de establecer articulaciones y de oportunidades para repensarnos y pensar estrategias para hacerle frente al embate de estos autoritarismos. Bueno, la segunda intervención es de María Camila Castellanos de Colombia, quien nos va a comentar sobre la represión de los movimientos sociales y la limitación de la libertad de expresión. María Camila es optómetra de profesión, activista en la defensa de los derechos humanos, desempeñó un papel determinante en la atención prehospitalaria de jóvenes agredidos en los ojos por el Escuadrón Móvil Antidisturbios de la Policía de Colombia, SMAT. Hizo parte del movimiento Mamás Primera Línea en defensa de las jóvenes en el estallido social de Colombia. Feminista y parte activa de la colectiva de mujeres en resistencia, hoy desde parte del equipo del Viceministerio de las Juventudes de Colombia. María Camila.
Muy buenas tardes a todos, todas y todes. Bueno, ahí perdonarán el titubeo, pero lo nuestro es la calle y no estos escenarios. Bueno, nosotros, la barriada popular, en un momento histórico de Colombia, salimos a la calle simplemente, como siempre lo hacemos, a una exigencia de justicia, de verdad. Pues porque Colombia no es que esté muy bien tampoco, ¿no? Y todo entra en una detonación en el asesinato de Dylan Cruz en el 2019, cuando la juventud empezamos a ver que ese joven que asesinan en una movilización podíamos ser alguno de nosotros, por la exigencia de justicia. Los medios de represión para Colombia han sido los mismos que en Latinoamérica. Las balas del Estado, el silenciamiento en las cárceles, las bombas en los territorios, escenarios de disputa ideológicos, pero esta represión se agudizó en las ciudades en el marco del estallido social, dejando un montón de víctimas oculares, dejando muchos compañeros y compañeras presos políticos, también dejando unas divisiones dentro del movimiento social que hay que decirlo, ¿sí? ¿Por qué? Porque también dentro de ese escenario de represión, el movimiento social hizo parte fundamental también de generar miedo dentro de la población. Y fue en un momento histórico a lo largo del paro nacional en que empiezan a meter miedo desde lo simbólico y se nos empiezan a meter los encapuchados a los conjuntos residenciales. Empiezan a decir que la juventud que salió por defensa de la vida se iba a meter a los conjuntos a dañar a otros. Y ese escenario jamás pasó. Después empezamos a movilizarnos, a recogernos como organizaciones sociales, a entender que la unidad dentro de la movilización social es la que nos va a permitir la transformación del país. En el centro de la ciudad, que es donde muere Dylan, empiezan a reprimirnos. Y ahí entendemos que nos tenemos que recoger desde la barriada popular. Y empezó la pandemia. Nos callan así de la nada con la pandemia. Pero en nuestros barrios populares, la pandemia trae hambre y aún más desigualdad.
And more inequality. And in the highest peak of the pandemic, a lot of young people came out to raise their voice from the popular town. In Bogota, 5 points in the peripheral areas, people began to come together to the movement, and this wonderful scenario came out of young people, workers, female and male, called the scenario of first line, the first defense against the state and the suppression. Within this scenario of suppression, we began to see the internal enemy, which is that after the youth group became the heroes of our countries when we got to position a president, because it was due to those that had been killed and injured. We became the junkies, a way of stigma, and we were not imprisoned after the social movement, but when we began to get organized from the peripheral areas, we began to be judged, and they began to tell us that the people in our residential areas could not stay in the round tables. Only certain political parties and groups could raise their voice. And we kept the resistance going with the youth group. Inequality kept being the same. Inequality continued. Hunger continued in our territories, and the police kept going to the park and also in the outskirts where we come from. And when the wave came of suppression of mortal victims, because they saw we were many, they began in an unmeasurable way in areas that were farther north of the city. We began to notice that they were not scaring us with gas, but with bullets. So it's not an equal force, and there's never been. And in that scenario, we have mortal victims, youth groups that go out in the street, and there was never a primary care. And that's also a way of suppression in our country. If we have ocular eye injury victims now, it's because the government, while the youth group was out in the street, they never accepted the entrance to a medical center, and that's also a way of suppression. Another way of suppression is with the first line moms, was to knock us over and stop us giving the basic food to prevent hunger. They would take away the food, saying that there was already a line in dispute in the district, and that was that the community basic food basket could be the kitchen soups could be areas of dispute, and we had violence. And from there, from the symbolic violence, we felt that we did not belong, and we began to call ourselves nobodies. The nobodies, because no one would identify with us and no political party would represent us, but we understood we had to vote for the least worst, and we began to organize ourselves. Even though we had a broken soul, a symbolic act we responded to, and we said, they're killing the youth groups in Colombia, we're going to go out as the caregivers. You attack us with suppression, we go out to care for others. And in that sense, when we began to care for others and we saw that we were part of a framework of conflict and the attack was not to the youth groups, but for the first line moms that were caregivers because they knew that they would have a highest defense of the territory, and that's where we began gathering the scenario. Afterwards, they had the illegal captures. Then the symbolic of being of the first line movement that we proudly say. And everyone talks about the pushback in Colombia. Everyone talks about at a given moment that the pushback in Colombia, there was a social movement, but now where the national government in its campaign said, the first line youth group will be freed. Up to now, it'll be 4 years and they have not come out. Not even one for 369 young people at a country level are still in prison. And this is a number, and we have other numbers that are even worse. We have colleagues that have been raped by the National Civilian Police. They had tours within the jail, and there was a scenario where they took away everything, and we would go out to a scenario of war within the cities. And we learned what the colleagues suffered in other areas that were isolated in Colombia. I began to do a tour of the country in other points of pushback to get to know if it was just in Bogota in these peripheral areas or how this would work with the resistance in Colombia, and if it was a different scenario and then I find Cali. And it was not called First Line Moms, but it was the communitary kitchen. In this area, we found out that there were many actors, and this was very atypical because I don't know what's the right word, but it was like the town delinquent area in those scenarios of pushback. In these atypical scenarios, they were the nobodies, the youth groups that, because they didn't have other options within the country, were dedicated to common delinquency acts, and they add themselves to these scenarios because they didn't have other options like Siloe, Puerto Resistencia, La Luna. And in Cali, there's a higher suppression because the pushback movement had weapons and a way to fight against those in an equal way. And that's why Cali has a scenario of highest deaths and injured with firearms, and not by weapons that were given to others, like the case of Jaimes, who is a person that was injured by a bullet. And within this scenario, Cali became a place of pushback because they began to be economically blocked because the ports were in this scenario. We began to block the country economically, but they did not tell us that we were blocking the country economically. They said we were blocking the small companies, so we became enemies of other companies and scenarios of others that had supported us, and they stopped doing so. In this scenario, wonderful in its multiple colors, but very complex, we noticed how youth movements that have been occurring historically confirm the peace movement in Colombia with the opposition were offered bullets, and the women that are caregivers in the framework of national strike were persecuted, and it was not a normal persecution for leaders, but it was given with our names and leadership roles. With all these scenarios of suppression, what we have left is to organize ourselves, because we understand that there are scenarios we positioned that never got a response, that never were given a hand. And to be radical about the cause is not to set everything on fire, but to defend and to struggle and never allow corruption and never allow the fear to organize ourselves and to not allow that systematic violence in the scenarios, because then they began to judge the movement of resistance. It's very complex. We have colleagues that are victims of people that we've said no to them, that we were not going to organize ourselves as they wanted. And we have victims that were harassed and vulnerable because of this scenario. They keep calling us names, but we're the first option when they want us to defend an amendment, when we need to go ahead and defend the national government. Now we're being symbolic victims of a state that does not represent us, because the resistance movement was not represented by the state. This was the only option we had, because we're being re-elected by the same, and we keep suffering violence. And the only thing that picks us up now, due to the suppression we are still in, is the love and rehumanization of social movement, to humanize within the scenario of picking up and resist from the micropowers, to push back from helping the youth group that was the one that suffered the greatest harm, and being able to have this scenario, because many youth groups of the pushback were hired by the government. Many leaders were kept in silence with a contract, and many of us are pushed back because they play with our hunger, and they are giving us a contract for us to remain in silence. And I believe that we are changing the policies of a country, because this youth group that's been organized from 20 years ago, because of the historical movements in Colombia, I believe we've transformed ourselves from different scenarios, and our groups from different organizations, we have corruption and violence, and that does not allow us to transform democracy in the country, because we're going to keep having the same scenarios, and that's what we're living now. Of course, with some advances, but our territory keeps killing, and we're still being put in jail, and we're being kept in silence with bullets that kill us from the state. And we keep organizing ourselves, not like they want us to, because they made us see that we needed to be organized ourselves in round tables. And with voting systems, we keep organizing ourselves with our own scenarios. And we were youth groups that never had access to public education. We will always be vulnerable in all scenarios, and we became the internal individual, but we will keep pushing back, and that's what matters.
Thank you very much, María Camila. A wonderful and personal experience of how people experience the mobilizations, and I'm going to take away these new mechanisms that have been developed, different landscape right now in Colombia, but you've been able to find new ways, new creative ways to be able to face this backlash, kind of like the community mothers in the front line. Then we're going to proceed now to our third presentation on behalf of Juan Pablo Muñoz. Juan Pablo Muñoz he's technical coordinator of Reform Alliance. He majored in law, and also in history in the USAC State University. He's carried out many judicial studies, for the judicial court studies over here, and then a researcher for Unity Watch, and he's written essays on the functioning of the judicial system, such as the Observer magazine. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, here present. Good afternoon, Jose Miguel, Ted, and María Camila. Thank you for the opportunity of being able to share this table and forum with you, as well as everyone who's here under the sound of my voice. And we are a Reform Alliance, which is an articulation of approximately 35 different civil society organizations that work on subjects on justice, human rights, and the democracy. We're going to address the subject of Lawfare, or the judicial war. And we're going to provide a conceptual synthesis, but applying it also to Guatemala from a book of the Valim and Sanding attorneys, which were Lula Gasilva, lawyers in 2017-2018 within the Lavallato case, thanks to which he was removed from the presidential elections so that Bolsonaro could win. And the initial effects of this are not only to the judge who sentenced him, giving him the prize of making him the Secretary of Justice, but they also handed over the Amazons, criminalization, tax exemptions, and another piece of the Bolsonaro package that we are all acquainted with. The Lawfare context here in Guatemala, just to place names and surnames to those driving it, we know that as of 2008-2012 here in Guatemala, there was a series of elements that caused certain developments like never before in the struggle against corruption and impunity. We're talking about CICIG, we're also talking about the Doctora Cali Paz y Paz, district attorney in Cali Manocal, who was very progressive in the UNE government. In other words, there were several circumstances in INASIF, even in the Supreme Court. We had Dr. Cesar Barrientos with criminal proceedings. There were many different developments that allowed us to make headway in this system. But the SCS, who were also known as clandestine and illegal operations, they started, especially in the cases of genocide, they then proceeded to mutate what CICIG qualified as a political network, a legal political network with a sole goal, which was to reconfigure the coopted reconfiguration of the state, And they demanded a new multi-author strategy, as well as a consolidation of all of these efforts, The opportunity to consolidate this was with the exit of CICIG in 2018-19. There was a judicial political strategy that aligned all three powers of the state. The capture of the public prosecutor's ministry in 2018, new courts in 2019, and the current constitutional court, which is about to be enacted in 2021, and the general prosecutors, human rights, the last line of institutional human rights safeguards in 2022 that were also affected. The result of all this is that the struggle against corruption and impunity was brought to a halt. We didn't have the personality to seek after high cases and criminal cases against defenders of human rights and activists and political opposers. Just a conceptual framework of what is a lawfare. It shouldn't be confused with the judicialization of politics, which are practices that have been seen since ever, within the legal framework. But for this to be lawfare, it's a consolidation of enormous multi-author network and justices, as well as assessment and consulting of military tactics. These are three traits to be able to refer to lawfare. Etymologically speaking, this is the contraction of English vocabularies, law, which is law, and warfare, which refers to war. During the last 25 years of the 20th century, many Western analysts stated that China would employ law as a war weapon against its political opposers. But to the year 2000, they said that no. They said that it was legitimate and valid to use the law to be able to obtain political results desired. As this started entering in the war manuals of certain nations, such as England, where they started defining it as a modality, as a method. Towards 2016, key treaty defined lawfare. Lawfare has two traits, utilizing the law to be able to create effects to those traditionally attained in military conventional actions, and that this action should be motivated by the desire of weakening or destroying their adversary. Lawfare. In other words, currently lawfare can be defined as the strategic employment to obtain political goals and social transformation. The two goals of lawfare, as many are aware, is the neutralization of the enemy or the utter destruction of the enemy. Of course, we're not speaking of the destruction such as in conventional war, in which is death, but in this case, we're speaking of a civil destruction. Yes, and this all hinges on many factors of the force that we have or the impact that one wishes to garnish. Lawfare has three dimensions, just like the analysis of any war. First, we have the battleground. The first thing that we define is what is going to be the battleground. That's what the first thing we define in a war. The other two are going to depend on this, and we're speaking of the jurisprudence, laws, and competence. In Lavallato, we know in Sao Paulo, the case against Lula wouldn't prosper, and so then they found Judge Mora in a different jurisdiction who stated, if you bring him here, I'll make sure to process him and sentence him. So then finding the right district attorneys, and we find this a lot here in Guatemala, for example, in the case of Pacheco and Chaclan, who had to find out the whole day and a half, till we had the right judge who had compromised her independence and partiality. And we're speaking about, criminal law, but it could also be civil law, because lawfare also applies towards economics, for example, to favor one business over another. But we're going to keep on criminal law. And defamation tourism, which is to employ different jurisdictions, setting different denouncements to see which law takes the case. Defining the battleground, yes. Normally where we're going to process the enemy that's been declared and identified, which we wish to neutralize or destroy, then we have armament. In a war, we're going to define what are going to be the weapons that we're going to be used. And we have 9 examples that everyone here in Guatemala, and well, surely in other nations of the region have seen, which serve as weapons for this judicial war. The predicate utilization of ambiguous laws, such as laws against terrorism, for example, laws against gangs, these which are so open that pretty much any type of activity could apply to this. For example, like the ones of terrorism, one group, one group sharing with another, illegal association, all these laws that have served to be approved at a global scale that national codes have also adopted. The second one is frivolous complaints or without just cause. This is an entry point, for lawfare. These cases normally do not have any grounding. What they're seeking is to have a prosecutor and a judge that have colliding together to process and to fill and flood this area with cases, using these weapons of torture to weaken the enemy. That this all depends on people and several circumstances. It's not the same a person who's overseeing the care of young boys, young girls, or the elderly, or who has certain personal circumstances in the process, versus other individuals that could possibly resist, jail times, and other times, solidarity networks, etc. And this is a consideration that prosecutors bear in mind to be able to ask these types of preventive or excessive preventive prison time, promote relations to legitimize the enemy and the breaching, and the leaks to the press. These are other powerful weapons for this. The law of accepting charges, for example, in the case of Guatemala, that's serving this purpose. For example, you take one individual, within the framework of a case, you take the assistant of a minister's assistant and correlating with this person, they start building a case because, like we said, there's no factual grounds to be able to build a case. And a person such as in the case against the journalist Chepe Zamora, that just with one individual stating to introduce the suspicion that there was any money in between within the framework of a transactional relationship, then they start sowing suspicion, which is precisely what they were after. Then excessive accusations or allegations is to accuse 5 or 6 crimes against a person and will provide a way out just by declaring or confessing to one as culpable. People are overwhelmed, even the attorneys. The defense becomes extremely pricey and anxious, knowing that you have 5 or 6 allegations, understanding what all this can boil down to. Then we have obstacleizing penal attacks, even to reach the point where you can no longer defend, such as the Chepe Zamora. This is asymptomatic. We know that 3 attorneys, if I'm not mistaken, resulted criminalized, including FOPA counsel, and at least 7 more refused to defend him. So then this is a common practice, and that's why we find so many attorneys now that are being criminalized. It's personal vendetta against them, but foundationally against those that they are defending. In the case of Dr. Claudia Gonzalez, for example, who was ex-mandatory of CICIG, they wanted to take revenge on her, but she was also the defender of at least 12 justice operators, among them, prosecutors and lawyers, attacking her, which means attacking her entire group as well. Duality between benefit and crime, accepting charges and offering people an easy way out in exchange for revealing or providing the basis to build a case, freedom of expression and opinion within, in order to declare a case under reserve and criminalize attorneys and all those that are processing it, and that the public prosecutor's ministry doesn't provide the files to the very defenders. And a case of exception, which is to create norms that are ad hoc for certain types of enemies defined by the state. So then this is the second dimension of lawfare, the battleground, laws of jurisprudence, and the weapons, legal tools that are going to be employed. And the third one, just as in every war, is propaganda. Manipulation techniques to create a favorable view in their strive or struggle against the enemy. We're under the intention of generating suspicion, demonizing the enemy, distorting reality by altering images and altering audios and tampering with evidence, and contubernio between judges and prosecutors and certain legal positions that provide the grand screen and stellar exposition for prosecutors to present their cases, and 2 recent cases such as fake news and net centers. Yes? So then these are two additional methods employed within this process. It's important to say that this legal war has entered within the war manuals as a hybrid method because it mixes conventional methods with non-conventional methods. In addition to lawfare, we have the media war and psychological warfare as well. And to close and end this point, we're going to be speaking about the psychological warfare because this is an auxiliary, or it's coupled with the legal warfare. It seeks to recollect intelligence information, legal information of the accused from their friends, their lawyers, or the relatives to be able to gain vantage points in favor of the prosecutors. Intelligence, counterintelligence of what we normally are aware of in the dirty wars that took place in Latin America. But a second one, which is much more legal, is the kidnapping of, the sequestering of smart devices or computers, and they're able to appeal strategies and defenses of certain lawyers, and people are criminalized even against their consent. And finally, the third point is the degradation and imitation of information with the enemy, to confuse them, to let them see through, to keep them from seeing through net centers and through certain publications, even of corporate means, everything that is to come, everything then to keep them, confused with half-truths, to generate that entire horrifying atmosphere that can hinder the defense. This is a little bit of what I wanted to expound, and as we stated, many of these tactics tend to be familiar, these strategies against political opposers, activists of human rights, and defenders of the nature, advocates that dare to be able to judge important cases of corruption, among others. Thank you. All right, then. Now with this last intervention, we'll be closing this exchange. And thank you, Juan Pablo, for this review concerning all these mechanisms and phases that lawfare entail. We're going to open the microphones now, please, for those who would like to share any remark, any questions. If you'd like to aim it at any of these three in particular, you can please proceed to do so or indicate this. Do we have any questions, any reflections? Anyone? Yes, we have one here. Go ahead.
And I wanted to ask you about crashing the empire, because from here it often feels like there's an hardening or an intensification of imperialism. We have the threats against the Panama Canal and Greenland. We have the reiteration of the Monroe Doctrine. We have the threats to invade Mexico. So I was wondering what you meant by by crashing the empire, because, like I say, it seems like the opposite sometimes.
I'm not sure if there's any another two questions yet before proceeding to respond. Are there, in addition, two questions anyway?
Hi, my name is Bella, and I'm with Global Exchange. Thank you for such an amazing discussion. I learned so much. My question is for Maria. I got my start in activism because of a shooting that happened in my community, and it was a youth-led movement that turned into a very big gun violence prevention movement that had young people from all over the United States participating and walking out. And I was inspired to hear about the young people in your country, in Colombia. So I was wondering, how can we build global solidarity between the United States and young people in both countries in Colombia, to see how we can work together, especially to stop, the flow of arms into the other Americas.
Gracias para Juan Pablo.
Some of the strategies being employed to be able to sort this type of lawfare that you might know, how can ways of counteracting or attacking this type of lawfare. Fidel, I'm not sure if there's any other questions. I believe we have a question for each of the panelists. If you want, we can proceed to respond. Oh yes, there's one more over here. The side, yes. Okay. Yes, one specific question for Camila, please. How have you been able to consolidate the organizational process of young people or youth in the movement that emerged with that explosion in Colombia, since with the arrival of progressive governments, many times they become much more waned, the social movements and those currently in operation. What is the role of SMILE in the current administration in Colombia? Are there any other questions? Any other? Yes? Okay. I guess we can proceed to respond. Oh, there is one. Thank you. It's a pleasure to greet everyone. Yes, my question is for Camila as well. Camila, I know, because this is really interesting. Everything that you've expounded is just absolutely phenomenal. So I'd like to know a little bit more. What is the strategy, the future strategy on how to handle the internal communication, within popular social organizations, and the misinformation? All right then. So we're going to start with Ted, Camila, and Juan Pablo. Yes? Ted.
Thank you very much for that question, Laura, about crashing the empire. What do I mean? I said they're not going to do it the way we like, and I agree with you that in the short term, we're going to see all kinds of hardening. That is the nature of what they're doing. But I think in a very historically short time, we're going to see that what Trump is doing will greatly reduce the power of the United States. And I don't think he's doing it on purpose, but what some of the factors, for example, Canada is a country that has been completely integrated with the United States, economically, militarily. Every time the United States fights an imperialist war, Canada has been at its side. Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it. Canada has always been there to do the United States bidding. And for Trump to break that relationship, so much so that the Prime Minister of Canada says it will never go back to being the way it was, this is a big blow eventually to the kind of soft power that the United States has used to hold the empire together. If you look at what's happening with Europe, Trump is crashing relationships that have existed since the Second World War, one after the other after the other. No one in their right mind is going to trust the United States to do what it says. And those are the implicit agreements that have also, they've held up many good things, but they've also held up the empire in a way that is fundamental to its existence. And perhaps most important, what Trump is doing with his tariff policy, above all, nobody can tell where it's going to go, up, down, inside, backside. But what is almost certainly an outcome of his strategy, if there is such a thing, or his actions, is that the US dollar will no longer be trusted as an international currency. Trump likes to say everybody in the world is ripping us off. That's not true. The way that the international economy has been structured with Bretton Woods and ever since the Second World War has been that the United States structurally rips off everybody else. And Trump either doesn't understand that or is too blind. I don't know what it is there, but he is going to create a situation in which the United States dollar ceases to be the reliable currency in the world, somebody else is going to step up. We don't know how that's going to happen, but we know it's underway, and he's accelerating it. That was already a trend in the world. Now he's accelerating that trend. So when you put all these things together, it's going to dramatically weaken the reach of the United States. To crash something like USAID, you know, a lot of us don't really like USAID, but you know, as I think a lot of people in this room recognize, there were a lot of good projects being carried out, and those were something that gave put a positive light for many people on the United States. That's all gone. The good parts of what it meant to be part of the empire are vanishing. So I think that's why he has created a trajectory down, and that's what we're going to see. I would like to say Global Exchange as a non-governmental organization has always been very clear that we will never take a dime, a dollar, a cent from the United States government. And that's one of the reasons that we're not affected by what's happening right now, because many organizations across the board, across the continents, have been affected dramatically, because when USAID pulled out, a lot of people were actually depending on that money. I don't think that it's a good thing that those programs have been abandoned, but it does open up a space for something else. And that's what it's going to be up to us to invent, essentially. And I don't mean just us in this room, but I mean us collectively, us in our organizations. We have to figure out a new path, because the old path is closing down. And that's what I mean. Yeah, we probably do, and we have a couple more days to work on that. So.
Please, just so that everyone can hear what the question was. Yes, it's an important question. I asked if we need to make the difference and distinguish between what is taking place in the relationships with the United States, with Trump, and the global north and the south global.
And I said, yes, there's a lot we have to figure out. That's one of the reasons that we're all here, is to have these conversations and try to understand each other. In the global north, we've been freaking out because of what's happening to the democracy that we thought existed in the United States. I say that collectively. A lot of us have had our deep, profound doubts about the structures that are called democracy in the United States, but the ones that are there now are being being eliminated very quickly. And while there are going to be actions in defense and attempts to restore the kind of democracy that existed, it's going to be something else. When we get to the end of this phase of struggle, and I think in some ways it's actually a moment of revolutionary struggle, because we're looking at a moment of deep institutional instability and possible change, that we have to be open. And I think that's why we're here, to the idea that we can create something better. And that if we put that as our agenda and figure out what it is that we're going to be asking for, that we can go in the right direction even from this moment. So from the crisis that we're facing to the strategy that we have to implement, I think it's important to recognize the way that typical traditional U.S. projection of economic and even military power is going to be very different, and we need to understand that and watch it very carefully.
Yo creo que y yo recojo. ¿Sí? Dime. Oh.
Okay, thank you.
All righty then.
Pues el tema también de la barrera
Well,
idiomática.
this idiomatic
Voy a
piece right here,
intentar
I'm going to try to convey and respond to my colleague who inquired on how to connect and exercise solidarity in this landscape of victims. And, well, there's several landscapes that we can add on to, that we connect to, but the most important one of all, nonetheless, I believe, personally, is on the subject of adding on based on love, yes, on collecting ourselves on these landscapes, meaning that young people, victims of the state explosion and any type of war scenario within the nation or throughout Latin America, well, these are young people that come with severe issues. One is mental soundness, mental health, young people that do not have access to health means, this is a landscape that we can connect in, where we can gather ourselves. And number three, there is another trait or feature over here that they're all young people that come from popular communities, that are entering into a stage of development who don't believe in these ideologies that many are pushing. And so then to add on, to connect, whatever you want to connect to, what can serve our different types of hands, to gather ourselves also as social movements to generate so that this movement of resistance, or the capucha, to become a political stakeholder, because we are a political actor. We continue being a political actor. Many of us have tried to take it off, but it was precisely to gather this, to start working in pro or in the benefit of these individuals. We didn't take it off because we wanted to, but because we had to work in this favor, and someone had to show their face, and that's why we're here present. So that it is the pre-landscape. Now the response to my colleague over there. First of all, how youth movements are organizing there in Colombia based on this state explosion. There are many different landscapes, but we also understand that this movement not only had to be organized based on lowering and involvement landscape within, and we also understood that we had to form to become an actor, a consequential actor with our dynamics within our communities, but that we also could not lower our guard within this mobilization effort. In Colombia, we have never lowered our guard concerning movements of resistance. Clearly, we no longer resist in the same ways or manners because we understood that the change of the current administration, well then yes, the government's no longer slaying us, but there are other actors of armed conflict that are slaying us. It's no longer the government that's taking our lives, not so much, because there are sectors throughout our nation that continue ruling, where the right continue ruling, and that the right continue slaying us, even if we have a progressive government, and they remain in silence. Why? Because they also taught us that if we had one sole victory concerning other landscapes, then we had to remain quiet. We had to keep silent. Right now we are a dissidence of that landscape. Why? Because if they go up to carry out actions that do not agree with our territories, then they have not come up to do anything. If they emerge to generate democracy that continues satanizing opposers, then they haven't come up to do anything. And this is something that as resistance movements, we are completely clear about, that we continue resisting from the trenches, from our landscape, from our popular community landscape. And now a couple of others, even academia, which has been quite difficult to enlist. In Colombia, as of Gustavo and Petro, in the youth landscape, or the youth environment, everything having to do with politics previously in this landscape was just a small piece or small cog within something known as Young Colombia, the Young Colombia movement. And these were more like counselors and those on stages. Then we create the Ministry of Equity and Equality, and it goes on to become a vice ministry, which is the one in which I'm currently serving and helping, which becomes a development and advance for young people, giving us logistics bags. You know, what do you people think of cholera in the nation with regards to everything having to do with armed conflict within these landscapes as well? So that not only are we disputing, you know, the youth councils and platforms, in addition to this, we are disputing the nation's economies as well. And this was a major milestone, you know, because they see young people as political actors, you know, that can cause an impact. Now, concerning SMART, well, there are certain developments there concerning how this comes out. Obviously, they no longer step out, you know, to gouge people's eyes or to slay or to kill. Although at the start of this Gustavo Petro's government, we had two people who had their eyes wounded, you know, in this national unity. And this is something we have to say. The National University, because certain decrees that were stated in the capital cities of Bogota, Decree 53, I believe, which we were part of the creation of this decree with a whole bunch of fallacies, 250,000. One decree towards social movements and towards this participatory landscape can't be created with those who breach us, which is the national police. We cannot be working. It can't be this mad. And the majority of attorneys that were within this landscape, they were part of this broad table, and it was the police themselves. You know, the police cannot step into to speak about a decree when it comes to such movements because they're the ones who repress us. But this also garnered us certain gains. You know, every mobilization has a participatory landscape within social dialogue and exchange. In other words, SMAT cannot be there, you know, the death squad cannot be there. They cannot be within social mobilizations. And there's a TMU which rises up, which was also birthed from this national explosion that was established by social and human rights advocates that birthed it to state when force isn't so gauged or measured within this landscape. Mobilization actually went down a lot when Petros was elected. Once again, because we believe that we have one initial milestone and we don't longer have to mobilize, you know. But we personally believe, or what we step out to say on this May 1st, is that we're still here and we're going to continue fighting and marching. And it's not because of Gustavo's administration, but because of these reforms that need to be enacted. And this youth movement is currently being transformed with regard to these state policies and how we can generate true democracy, not neoliberal in nature. And responding to, I'm going one by one, bear with me over here, to my peer over here. I believe that it's really simple, real easy, you know, it's a no-brainer. Social movements, you know, they continue lying to themselves. And it's to state that we are now in power and that we can transform our own power dynamics from within. I recall a conversation, because I'm a young person and I work within power structures, a conversation from Catharsis with Minor. And it was concerning that I was saying, you know, I can't stand this anymore because this is a landscape that really, you know, whenever you step into power, when you start to manage in a position, you see that there's so many countless corruptions within the structure. And Minor was telling me, you know, if not you, then who? So then we started to transform and building within our government a dissidential voice, saying this is corrupt. This is how we're ill-treated. We've got to transform the way in which young people participate. We've got to transform it at a grassroots level. And within our social landscape, we have to radicalize. You know, we can't afford to continue allowing, you know, that they give us something in exchange for our own dignities. No, we are in the social state of the law. And this is something that social movements have got to strive and fight for. Because They are stripping away and chipping at our dignities. So we place progressive governments, for social rule of law, and they continue negotiating with social leaderships. And the rest of the social movement, just, eating an ice cream. This is what we need to radicalize the cause, to say, we do not want any more corruption. We've got to have austerity within our landscapes of our mandates. We've got to think in different ways of real involvement and engagement, because they are such disappointments now. Complex and cumbersome. I am beyond disappointed in the current administration of my nation, because we gave our lives, we sacrificed our lives, and right now we have many in prison. As a feminist, we have Benedetti governing today. When Benedetti is a breacher of women. And always the most stricken within the social movement, the popular movement, it's always the women who have to take the beating, We always have abusers governing us, and this happens historically, and today we're rising up and saying, no more violations, not psychologically, not politically, and no more violence in this regard. And we will not gather together with Sana Mohammed, because he stands up and says, for example, he stood up and said in a state meeting, I don't sit down with Benedetti because he's an abuser. But they gave him another charge with greater impact, and there he did sit with Benedetti, to work together. No, we will not negotiate with these breachers, nor ever. At least the Calle will never do. At least, popular movements and grassroots movements and youth movements, we will not negotiate with them, because our dignity, we are not supposed to negotiate with it. And that's where we need to transform the ways of ruling and governing. That's all? Great.
Question. The question on how to share. The first is, by its own way, to understand that these cases are not judicial, they're political, and the best technical judicial strategy when the judge and prosecutor are together will allow for cases to move forward. We've known about judicial operators that have to go into exile because they have 50 demands against them, and they would have to be the next 15 years going to hearings, and not just justice officials, but other categories that are being attacked. So perhaps this would be the first one, and the lawyers that don't have the right to freedom are imprisoned. So this doesn't mean that we should not have a technical defense. You have to do it with lawyers, but it does not guarantee justice. And the second one is the co-optation of all justice systems. In the case of Guatemala, in 2024, in October, we had the opportunity, I'm not sure if we had it, but we had re-elections of the Supreme Court, and then also we didn't do so well, and we had the renewal of the Supreme Court, and they're gonna have the rules for the next process in 2027, electoral process. And in April, the Interconstitutional Court, we know that they will all stop in the second instance, but with the Public Prosecutor's Office in May 2026, it's part of what they are supporting within San Carlos Public University of Guatemala, and with those that will be voting during those elections for the public prosecutor. So working on the co-optation of the justice system in an articulated way is fundamental. The third one is to fight against misinformation, the war of publicity to destroy the colleagues somehow. needs to be worked on from the organizations. And the last one, I'm not sure, and I'm not totally liberal, but in the sense of crisis of the type of judgments, we for many years supported the laws of terrorism, and we took many human rights away, awaiting for this to bring us more safety, and accepting certain judgments would help because this would be applied by people that we trusted were honest, but they at the end were applied by the current judicial authorities. In conclusion, having this midterm review of an amendment of the judicial system to return individual guarantees to the people. Thank you. Well, thank you. We will wrap it up here. I believe the three forms relate. Well, it tells us about the authoritarianism, how this keeps us in silence of the voices that should exist within democracy. Democracy should be noisy, and authoritarianism wants to keep us in silence, which takes me to remind you that you have to fill out your post-it with the questions that are on the board. We're going to go to lunch now. Thank you.